if you have any questions, either throughout or at the end, please consider using the question format within the webinar frame here. You can write in questions that you might have as we go along. You can we'll be able to raise your hands at the end if you have, if you want to say something or ask Jim directly anything. So feel free to ask as many questions as you like. This won't take a full hour otherwise. So please consider those things. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Jim, and I'm going to be quiet because I think everybody would rather hear you than me. So thank you very much, Jim, for doing this, and thank you all for getting on the call this afternoon.
Yes, thank you, Doug. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're surviving the switch to daylight savings time. I know I'm still figuring out all the clocks in the house, so it's a continuing struggle there. Well, today we're going to talk about the 4th National Climate Assessment. We're going to focus in on the Midwest chapter, where I was one of the lead authors for that. And on the screen there, you can see the link to the whole report. And then you can drill down into the specific chapters. There's chapters for each region of the United States, and there's also chapters by sector. So there's like forestry and agriculture and all those things in there as well. So you kind of slice and dice it any way you like there. There's lots of detailed information, and we're just going to kind of go over some of the things for the Midwest. And to start out with, just to give you a little bit of background, these are reports that are mandated by Congress every 4 years. They've been a little longer than 4 years apart, but they've been starting since the 1990, and involves 13 federal agencies. So it's a pretty substantial effort with about 300 authors. And many of them are federal scientists, but we also have folks from colleges and universities and some the private sector and nonprofit sector as well. So a wide variety of experts across the U.S. that go into this 2-year project. And it's basically a 2-year-long effort of writing and reviews. For me personally, it's probably the most reviewed document I've ever worked on. I think in my folder on my computer, I've got about 8 versions of the chapter because of all the revisions and reviews that we've gone through. So it's been extensively reviewed and commented on by, really just about anybody. So it's very extensively reviewed, and so we'll talk about some of the findings here today. Now, when we talk about the Midwest, I think there's lots of definitions that are floating around out there, depending on where you are, but kind of the core area is Missouri through Minnesota, and then points eastward to Ohio, and then Wisconsin and Michigan, and those are kind of the core area that compose most of the Midwest. Sometimes they could spill over into other regions that have commonalities with other bordering states, but that's kind of the core area. And you see here that the other regions of the U.S. were treated separately in NCA4. So widespread coverage across the U.S., and we're going to focus mainly on the Midwest and the Great Lakes region. However, there's going to be a Great Lakes webinar next week, and that one will focus more on issues specific to the Great Lakes region. So I'll kind of talk about the Midwest in general. That will be more specific. We had a team of 12 authors. I was the lead on I guess you call it the civilian side, the non-federal side, and then Chris Swanson of the Forest Service was the federal coordinator, lead author. And we had other authors across the region, some on the federal side, some from land-grant universities and other associations. So it was, turns out that almost every one of these people even if they didn't reside in the Midwest, they had some connection with the Midwest. So that was great to have everybody on board. So the contents of the report, we look at a couple of things. One is the observed climate change and impacts that we're seeing in the region. And then we tried to identify potential future risk from climate change. and also give some examples of adaptation strategies that are occurring in the Midwest. So it's a combination of those three things that we focused on. And so so for each one of our topics, we had examples of each of those. And let me also say that this is volume 2. There was a volume 1 that was released a year earlier in November 2017. And that has really kind of the nuts and bolts of climate change in the U.S., all the details about the temperature changes, the precipitation changes in severe storms and tornadoes and hurricanes and all that good stuff. And they noted, amongst other things in that report, that this period is now the warmest in the history of modern civilization, and certainly the warmest in U.S. history, and that human activities, especially the emission of greenhouse gases, are the dominant cause of the observed warming since the mid-20th century. So they were pretty adamant about the fact that it was the warmest and where that warming is coming from. And it's actually a very interesting report that goes into all kinds of details on climate change in the United States. So you want to check that one out as well. And kind of the basics, and you probably have seen this before, is the global temperature. There's the year-to-year changes over time since the 1880s to the present. And really, since the 1940s, we've been in a warmer period. And I would say since the 1970s, we've seen this steady march upward in the temperatures. That's really been outstanding. Nothing like anything we've seen in the historical records, and even many of the prehistorical records haven't seen this kind of an increase over this short of a period of time. Now, the map on the right shows the surface temperature changes in degrees Fahrenheit, and it's truly is global warming in the sense that almost all places on the globe are warming to some degree or the other. Now, it turns out, if you look closely on that map of North America, you can see a portion of the United States, especially the Southeast, but including parts of the Midwest, that haven't warmed up as much as some other parts. So North America, the really strong warming has been in the northern latitudes and in the western portions of the United States. And we kind of expected that going into this even 30 years ago, that the most pronounced warming would be in the northern latitudes, or the more polar latitudes. And if you look at that report, they also look at using model runs and other measurements. They can estimate the forcings that's causing the warming, and pretty much all of it is human-induced. Solar and volcanic, very small contributions, kind of in opposite directions there, but very small contribution to the overall energy balance of the world. And the human-caused changes are by far the biggest factor in that. If you look at scenarios, we looked at a couple of those when we did this report. The RCP 8.5 and the 4.5 are really the two that we probably looked at the most. We had a high scenario and a low scenario. And they just represent how the future may play out. And, when you're doing any kind of risk analysis or planning for the future, you kind of want to look at it kind of a moderate look at things, and then you also kind of look at a more severe case to kind of get an idea of the bounds of how things may play out in the future. So that's really all we were trying to do here. We weren't predicting a particular occurrence in the future. We're just kind of looking at the spectrum of possibilities going forward. Now, in this chapter, we identified what we called key messages. And there was actually 6 of those, and we'll talk a little bit about each one. We don't have time to really go into detail about all of them. But we also did a special case study of the Great Lakes region. And like I said, there'll be a special seminar or webinar next week that'll focus more on that. But the 6 that we had in the Midwest were agriculture, forest and ecosystems, human health, infrastructure in the Midwest, and also vulnerable communities. So these are kind of the main ones that we found had big impacts from climate change already and expected to have problems in the future. And I think probably everybody, when you mention the Midwest, even from outside the Midwest, you think a lot about agriculture. So since that's kind of my area of expertise, I'll probably talk more about that today than the others. If you look at the numbers for agriculture right now, probably our biggest challenges so far have been from warm season humidity increases and also increases in both precipitation amounts and the increase in heavy rainfall. That has caused problems with eroded soils and created favorable conditions for pests and pathogens and degraded the quality of stored grain. It also led to increased loss of nutrients off of the soils and all sorts of things like delays in planting and things like that. So it's been pretty problematic. I'd say probably dollar-wise, and I know specifically for Illinois, that's probably been the biggest headache in the last 10 to 20 years has been this trend towards wetter conditions in terms of the agriculture. But so far, as I kind of hinted at with that earlier map, is that Midwest, for the most part, has avoided a lot of the increase in temperatures that we've seen in other parts of the U.S. That's likely to change as we move into the future. By mid-century, it could have a significant impact on agriculture production and actually reduce the production unless we have major technological advances, such as improvement in hybrids or changes in agricultural practices. So that's probably our biggest challenge moving forward is, along with the precipitation, there's this expected increase in the temperatures. You look at annual precipitation across the U.S., really the central U.S. Has been getting wetter over time, depending on the metric you look at. It's on the order of about 10 to 15% increase over the last century. In this case, we're comparing the early 20th century with the more recent time period. And it's pretty widespread across the Midwest. I think pretty much every state has been getting wetter. And we see that not only in the annual precipitation, but especially in the winter and springtime precipitation, and even the summertime precipitation has increased in many areas. So this is a pretty significant impact for us in the Midwest. We've also seen an increase in humidity levels, and this may actually be an indirect effect in the fact that as we get overall wetter conditions, that a lot of that moisture, especially by the time you get into summer, it gets recycled back into the next thunderstorm. And so you kind of get this feedback operation going with between the land surface and the atmosphere. So increased humidity levels have been noted as well. In fact, an interesting side note is that we've actually seen that nighttime temperatures in the summertime have been creeping upward in the last century because of the higher humidity levels. The dew point temperature kind of acts as the floor for nighttime temperatures in the summer, and when you as it gets more humid, those temperatures increase, and so it really leads to not only more humid conditions, but a lack of cooling off of temperatures at night. And that can be extra stressful on both livestock and crops as well. Also, maybe the upside or the other side of all this is with precipitation is that along with the increase in precipitation, we've actually have seen a reduction in long-term drought. This is the Palmer Drought Index, and I just picked the Corn Belt, which pretty much represents the upper Midwest here. Drought was a big problem in the 1920s and 30s and even into the 40s and 50s. We've actually had in the last several decades more cases where the drought index is in the green, which means it's in wetter than average conditions than it has been in the drought conditions. So you can see the droughts of 1988 and 2012 there, but they're not quite as strong as some of those back in the 1930s, and they're much more spread apart than they were back in the 1930s. So we are definitely operating in a warmer, wetter climate, fewer long-term droughts, although we can't take drought off the table. There's still that risk of drought moving forward. The other thing that we've seen a lot of is not only the overall wetter conditions, but the fact that we're seeing more of the heavy rainfall amounts. This particular graph is for Illinois, but it's the observed number of extreme precipitation events, and they're defined as those that are 2 inches or greater. So it's averaged across all the stations in Illinois, long-term stations. And you see, you go back to the 1920s and 30s, you might only see a little over one of those for every half decade there. And in the last second half of the record, they become much more frequent. And in fact, in the last part of this study from 2010 to 2014, you see about 2 of those for every 5 years. So it's essentially about double the frequency of these really heavy rain events. And 2 inches is kind of the magic number because that's about the point where you start seeing flooding in fields, floodings in rivers and streams, and also in urban areas as well. And I will say, as an aside, we did a study in Illinois a few years ago. One of the big problems we have in Illinois and other urban areas is that across the U.S. is that we've seen that with this increase in heavy rainfall events that we're getting more urban flooding outside of the river basin, river flooding. So you get more basement flooding, street flooding, flooding of businesses, and that can actually lead to substantial losses. There in a 10-year period, we had about $2 billion in insured losses in Illinois alone. So it's a pretty substantial problem for us in places like Chicago and Milwaukee and St. Louis and Des Moines and other large cities. We look at the future. Here's some scenarios from the higher scenario, and really they're all pointing towards the wetter conditions in winter and spring, maybe some drier conditions in summertime, and fall has always kind of been the toss-up. That's the one season where we really don't see that much change and not that much going into the future. But more wintertime precipitation and springtime precipitation, that's probably going to play out as more rain rather than more snow. Summertime, that could be problematic, especially when we get warmer summer conditions. We could dry out a lot faster. So we could see more of the really short, intense droughts like we saw like in 2012, where we basically had a drought from about May to July, and then it was gone. So if you look back at volume 1 of the report, their statements on precipitation is their expected precipitation to continue to increase, and they give it medium confidence in their language. But they give high confidence for an expectation of an increase in frequency of the heavy rainfall, both the amounts and the frequency of those events. So I think heavy rainfall events are going to be a continuing headache for us in the Midwest moving forward as we face these 2, 4, and 6-inch precipitation events that really cause so much trouble. And just kind of give you a thumbnail sketch of the kind of headaches we're seeing in the ag sector. We've seen reduced workable field days, planting delays, especially in the last 5 or 10 years. And you get into the cost of replanting and the complications of that, and the overall concerns of soil compaction. So there's always that temptation to get into the field while it's still too wet and compact those soils, and that reduces productivity. We have drainage issues, as you can see here in this photo. We also have nutrient loss, as not only does the water run off carrying the soils, but it also carries off the nitrogen as well. And we see more plant disease. Whenever you have wet conditions and humid conditions, you just see more occurrence of especially leaf diseases on corn and soybeans and other crops. On the upside, we have seen introduction of new practices in the Midwest, or expansion of practices, conservation practices, to help reduce the impact of these heavy rains. And one of the ones that we showcased was an Iowa State study where they actually put strips of native prairie vegetation in amongst the row crops to reduce both the sediment and nutrient loss in fields. And I was looking at the numbers for that, and it is pretty substantial. I think there's about a 90% reduction in soil erosion off of the field from having these native species in there to help hold the soils in place. And another benefit of using native plants is they're pretty hardy against any kind of climate extremes. and they're also natural pollinators. So it's kind of a win-win situation for everybody. There's a little bit of lost productivity on the field level when you do this, but you get the benefits of, as I've just stated. So kind of a nice balance out, and I think a lot of farmers in the study that they did was very interested in continuing this. We also have an expansion of overall cover crops during the non-growing season from about November to March, which cover crops help hold in the soils in place and help hold in those nutrients as well. If we look at temperatures, what we've observed so far, this is the map of the United States, where we see red. We've seen substantial warming over the last century of 1 to 2 degrees or more. So you see places out west and up north that are really warmed up. So in the Midwest, it's really the upper Midwest that's seen the strongest warming over the last century, and especially the last 30 or 40 years. In the summertime, it's not quite as strong, and I think it's in part because the daytime temperatures have not been increasing, but the nighttime temperatures have. So it's kind of a mixed bag there for summertime temperatures. That's why you don't see the strong warming there across the Midwest. You get a lot of blues and light tans. But overall, we've seen strong warming, especially in the wintertime and in the springtime as well. And those are going to have, and that's likely to continue as we move forward. In fact, if you look at the projected changes in temperatures by mid-century, it's in the order of about 3 to 5 degrees by mid-century, kind of in that ballpark. And then you get in the late century, it's a little warmer, and it's probably especially warmest in the higher scenario, where you could see 7, 8, or 9 degree warming across the Midwest. So that's much warmer temperatures than what we've experienced till now, and it's at a much faster rate. So, mid-century isn't that far off. It's about in the neighborhood of the 2040, 2050, 2060 time period there. So that's not that far down the road. So that is a much faster warming than what we have experienced in the last 30 years. So big changes expected in the temperatures. And it has us worried, especially when it comes to agriculture, because agriculture is very sensitive to especially daytime and summertime temperatures. So if you look at some areas, we kind of looked at two extremes, northern Minnesota and southern Missouri. That's kind of the north-south extent of our region that we're talking about today. And in the historical data, you see numbers like a 5-day heat wave of 88, an average of 88 degrees in Minnesota and 97 degrees in southern Missouri. And I've been in southern Missouri when that's happened. That's pretty common. By mid-century, you add about 5 degrees to that, and by the late century, you're adding a few more degrees on top of that. So it's, or with the higher scenario, it's even a few more degrees above that. So by the time you get by the mid-century, you're looking at over 100-degree weather being fairly common over a 5-day stretch. So that's a pretty substantial heat wave at that point. That has big impacts on agriculture, not only for crops, but also for livestock. And in the Midwest, probably the two main crops that we grow are corn and soybeans. I would say corn is probably a little more sensitive to temperatures than soybeans. Corn, its optimal growing temperature is about 80 or so degrees, and once it gets about a 105, it really puts an impact on corn production. And especially critical is the timing of the heat during reproduction. So that's usually sometime in July. Once it gets to be 95 or so, you kill off the silk, so it can't reproduce, and therefore that's the direct impact on yield. Soybeans are a little tougher. They can spend a little warmer temperatures, a little more tolerant. As a result, in the Midwest, the soybean belt has stayed a little farther south than the corn belt has, actually whittling away a little bit at the southern part of the corn belt, and some of it's actually moving northward into the Dakotas and Minnesota. And there's an EPA study that in 2017 that showed that corn yields would drop by about 7% in the Midwest by mid-century and 18% by the end of the century under the high scenario. Not quite as much with the lower scenario, but they would still drop. So that's our concern is, especially with corn, that we're going to see loss in production without the introduction of new hybrids. Some other factors that we have seen already in agriculture is this combination of mild winters and warm early springs. Paradoxically, it actually increases the risk of frost damage because sometimes you can cause a false spring where, for example, fruit trees can break dormancy too early. It actually makes them vulnerable to the inevitable frost that comes later on. And so we've actually seen big production losses in several years, including 2012. And I think 1997 were some pretty big years for losses in things like apples and peaches across the Midwest. So there are some downsides to those milder winter temperatures. There are some upsides, so to speak. One is the change in the length of growing season in the Midwest. It's increased by on the order of about 2 weeks. Most of that increase has been on the springtime side. Fall's been more or less about the same, but we're actually gaining a little bit over time on the growing season on the front end. So that's great news for corn and soybeans and things like that. It's also not so good news for weeds and pests, because that means they also have an increased growing season. So additional opportunities for growth and reproduction. So it's kind of probably the end result, it's kind of a wash, but it's something that has been changing and expected to change in the future. So we look at forest, and is another one of our key messages. And I apologize for having all this verbiage on the slide. You're not supposed to do that, but I just wanted to get all the key message on there. You actually look at the report and see this in more detail. I just wanted to point out that we do note that there are threats here that from climate change, and it's also interacting, and this is very typical, interacting with existing stressors such as invasive species and pests, and that's led to increased tree mortality and reduced forest productivity. And I think land managers are beginning to manage these risks by increasing the diversity and selection of tree species to adapt to a range of projected conditions. So they're already looking to the future of how they're going to manage these forests. And it's a big challenge with corn and soybeans. You just plant another variety the next year, but it takes a lot longer planning process and adaptation process to manage a forest. Now, normally, I always think of the Midwest being more agriculture, but we actually have large stretches of forest in the Midwest, especially in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan, but also have southern forests in Missouri and southern Illinois, as well as southern Indiana and Ohio. Different kinds of forests. It's mostly oak hickory in the areas that I grew up in, but you get farther north, there's more of those northern forests. And so, and some of this is federal, some of it's state, a lot of it's state, but we also have a lot of private forest as well that's managed for timber production. And so it's a pretty substantial economic impact in the Midwest. There is efforts underway to plan for climate change, and this is one of my favorite stories. This is the Menominee Tribal Enterprise up in northern Wisconsin, and that's looking to diversify the forest by replanting forest openings that were already left open by oak disease, and they're selecting their new plant species based on the expectation of future climate conditions. So planning for warmer forest conditions in the future, and using that as they replant the forest. So that's an example of the kinds of things that are going on on the forestry side. It's really kind of the same story with ecosystems. So there again, there's a lot of stressors underway along with climate change. Again, it's the non-native invasive species, it's the pollution and the habitat loss and so forth that are putting a lot of pressure on the ecosystems we got. There is a lot of work underway to restore the ecosystems in the Midwest. I think there's probably a higher appreciation of that now than there has ever been in the last 150 years after we've made widespread efforts to remove all that. It's now coming back, and we see the benefits of that in terms of helping with water quality and flood control and crop pollination and things like that. So there's a lot of efforts underway, and especially in wet old Illinois and other places, restoration of wetlands has been going on for quite some time, and those are efforts there's a lot of success stories in that, and that will continue on into the future. So we've also one of the other key messages in the Midwest was human health. Climate change is going to be a big challenge for human health. We're introducing new threats and having many old threats by the increasing in the frequency intensity of poor air quality days. You get a lot of heat, you get a lot of ozone days, especially in the urban areas. That's very problematic. Extreme high temperature events and heavy rainfall, as I mentioned earlier, those are all health hazards, as well as the extended pollen season and the distribution of disease-carrying disease and insects. Urban areas are been noted to be vulnerable to heat conditions. We've also seen that even rural areas can also be very vulnerable to heat events because even though they're low population density, they tend to have poor health services. Everything's spread out much farther. So if you have a heat stroke, you may be 50 miles away from the hospital instead of 5 miles away. So it's big impacts across the region. So it's going to be a big challenge for the basic health services in the Midwest as we move forward, as they deal with all these issues. For example, there's just one sense of heat mortality from extreme heat, and this is by the end of the century, so the 2090 time frame. And with the lower scenario, we're looking at about 4 to 6 deaths per 100,000 people per capita. And then with the higher one, it's actually more like 10 to 12 and across the Midwest there. So substantially higher risk from extreme heat events is moving forward. That's going to be a big stress on the health systems across the Midwest. Also, the labor costs is another thing. I always think of mortality, but labor costs are going to be higher under high heat, especially under the high scenario. And in fact, the annual cost of the Midwest could be up to $9.8 billion per year by 2050, and up off the charts at $33 billion per year by 2090. And this is because when it's hot out, you got outside workers, construction workers, you got people working in the fields, and even some of the manufacturing jobs where it's just too hot to work, and so there's lost productivity, lost wages from that, and also higher risk of heat stroke and heat exhaustion during those times too. So all of that adds up to pretty substantial losses. Now, another thing to just talk about real briefly here, and this is this idea that as we go on into the future, we're expected to see, for example, in this case, more extreme heat. This is actually a snapshot from the Chicago area, and I guess it's kind of turquoise bars there. That's the lower scenario, and the red bars are the higher scenario. And each one of those scenarios, we ran a whole series of climate models. So each one gives you a slightly different result. When we talk about the future, one of the things is that yes, as you get farther into the future, the uncertainty gets larger and larger. The spread gets larger and larger as those bars get taller and taller there. The red dots there are the turquoise dots are the average of each of the sets of model runs. So you get the overall sense that things are increasing. But then the uncertainty also increases as well. And you could say, if you're an optimist, you can say, well, that means maybe it won't be so bad. But you can also see in the upper end, they could actually be much stronger as you move forward. So, for example, by mid-century, in this case, Chicago, the range from the lower scenario goes from about 0 to about 15 days per year with over 100 degrees. But the higher scenario, it's actually about 1 to, looks like about 24, 25 there. And to put that in perspective, the frequency of it right now is about 1 every 3 years. So it's a pretty rare event in Chicago right now, and it may be much more common moving on into the future. And the expectation is it could be much more, so as you go farther out. So it just kind of gives you a sense that there is this spread in the models as you go farther out, but you really have to plan for both the average expectation of the future and the higher or worse expectation of the future as well. Now I get into key message number 5, transportation infrastructure. This is another one where I've done a lot of work in. And again, it goes back to this heavy overall weather conditions and more heavy rainfall events have caused quite a bit of impacts on the transportation in the Midwest. And we're kind of a transportation hub of surface transportation and on our rivers and rail lines and roadways. And so time you have big rainfall events, you can see major disruption. This is a picture of Interstate 44 near St. Louis. This is almost a regular occurrence now. This happened in 2015 and 2017, and since this report came out, we've also had trouble in 2018, and even just recently, last month, we had some big rains a little farther south, so St. Louis kind of dodged the bullet this time, but heavy rains across the Ohio River Valley that caused quite a bit of flooding there as well. So this has been an ongoing struggle as we move forward. So this is, again, not something that's a theoretical thing about the future. This is something we're already dealing with right now. So message number 6, the community vulnerability and adaptation. We're about to the end here. So these are the at-risk communities in the Midwest. They're most vulnerable to climate change impacts, including flooding, droughts, and urban heat islands. I know from past studies that especially the areas that were lower income areas are most vulnerable. They just don't have that much resilience against climate change as perhaps some other areas do. They may be more likely to be living in the floodplains, have less access to health care and mental health care. And tribal nations are especially vulnerable because of their reliance on these on natural resources for their cultural source needs and also subsistence and economic needs. So there is kind of a special case of communities that are especially vulnerable to and for any kind of climate change. And there was actually an article that came out on NPR back in August of last year that if you want to drill down and kind of see what the impacts are in a specific area, they focused on Midwest production of wild rice, which is the staple for Native Americans. Turns out wild rice is not only something they use for a food source, obviously, but it's also used in traditional ceremonies. And wild rice is really kind of adapted to a fairly short growing season. That's its advantage over other plants in the northern part of the Midwest, is that it can thrive in those shorter growing seasons. So as things get warmer and wetter, you're going to have more trouble with losing out to invasive species and poor yield because of frequent flooding of the rice fields. So it's going to have a big impact on the communities up there. So kind of in summary, as we begin to wrap things up here, we've seen observed impacts in the Midwest, and these have been substantial in the last 30 or 40 years. Primarily, so far, it's been a shift towards wetter conditions with more heavy rain events. I'd say the future challenges will include the arrival of increased temperatures and extreme heat events, even as early as mid-century. And then we do have adaptation and mitigation efforts underway, but much more is needed. So that's the view there, and I will stop on this slide because this has the link to the actual chapter that we just talked about, so you can dig into that. There's much more to, to cover on that, and that you can enjoy at your leisure there. But at this point, I'll stop, and we'll field any questions you might have.
Thanks, Jim. That was very complete and fantastic. We have about 40 people on the line, and I don't have any questions except, and if anybody has a question, you can raise your hand, and I'll just unmute you if you'd like, or you can type them into the questions section of the webinar if you'd like. Either way, raise your hand. There's going to be a question here. I'll go to Valerie. So Jim or Valerie, I hope you're live. Go ahead. Okay, Valerie, are you muted? Have you muted yourself, maybe?
I have muted myself. I'm sorry.
All right, there we go.
Can you hear me now?
Hi, how are you? Yes, I hope you're doing fine.
I'm good. I'm great, thank you. Yeah, I just have a question about, you mentioned specifically some invasive species. Are there any specific invasive species that are of concern for the Midwest?
Yeah, okay. Now you're asking outside my area of expertise, but yes, we have. There's some, and I'm probably more familiar with some of the agricultural ones that have come in. That Palmer Amaranth, there's one that we've had a lot of trouble with, and some of these are actually fairly resistant to any kind of control by chemicals. So that's especially problematic. So they're not only invasive, but they're also resistive to any kind of practices we have. So those can be pretty problematic. There's a couple others, like kudzu is typically pretty much a non-starter in the Midwest, just because our winters typically are cold enough that it kills it off. So that's so far been held back, but that's likely to creep into the southern parts of our region moving forward. Also, some plant diseases. There was a big scare a couple of years ago with soybean rust, which seems to be pretty much confined to the southeastern United States, but that could move into the Midwest too. There again, it's one of those things that are traditionally cold winter temperatures, especially like this year, tend to hold that at bay, but that may not be true in the future.
Yeah, and I think there's quite a bit of literature out there on specific animals and plants that are invading, so to speak. Some of those are simply brought over from different countries for whatever reason. They are invasive, but they're not necessarily a climate. They don't have a connection to climate, other than they're very happy to be here just as well as wherever they came from. I do also want to make one other thing. I forgot to say this, and I apologize. This is recorded, and we will put it up on probably a YouTube site or something like that. The National Climate Assessment folks will see to it, and I will resend that link out so you can share it with anybody you'd like to, or tell anybody if you think it was worth listening to Jim, which of course I know it is. That's the main point I wanted to make there too. Valerie, did you have another comment?
No, thank you so much.
Thank you, Valerie. Hey, I also wanted to say something to you, and I have another question just after I say this. Jim, this year is extremely wet. Now, I'm not going to say this year being last fall or even last summer into fall, into winter, into early spring, at least in terms of climatological spring. Across the Midwest has been extraordinarily wet, record wet in some places. Can you give us, and again, I'm not going to say this is a climate change event, even though it's lasted quite a while and it's been wet for a long time, but can you sort of maybe talk about how this is indicative of conditions that we have seen, certainly have seen these before, but if this fits into some of the things you were saying during your talk as stereotypical behavior, if you will, across the Midwest from a climate point of view.
Yeah, that's a good point. We have, especially in the last several years, we've had a lot of trouble with, I actually call them out-of-season flooding events, in the sense that most of the time, most of our heavy rainfall events are more of a springtime or fall. It's usually associated with a large system that moves through and drops widespread rain. Usually our driest time of the year is actually January and February. We don't notice it because we're getting snow rather than rain, but for most of the Midwest, January and February, we only get about, many places, 2 to 3 inches of actual water content during those winter months. And yet we're seeing in the last several years, in fact, I've actually lost count of the number of times we've seen these, like this year at the Ohio River Valley, where you get 4, 6, 8 inches of rain over about a 3 or 4 day period. Just a whole season's worth of precipitation in a very short time. And these are the kind of things that we're expecting in the future, and that as you get a warmer winter conditions, they typically are wetter as well. So that does play into that kind of narrative of these wetter conditions overall, but especially kind of what I call the off-season heavy precipitation event. So it caused lots of flooding, because usually that time of year the soils are already saturated. We don't, there's no vegetation growing at that point, so the soils don't dry out very fast, especially with the cold temperatures. Also, many fields will be bare during that time of year, so are a lot more vulnerable to flooding and to soil erosion. So it's very problematic to have these kind of off-season events like this.
Right. Yeah, and that leads into another question that we got. It says, with the increase generally of precipitation, does that necessarily mean more intense storms? And I think you addressed this when you were talking about the 2-inch rainfalls and all that business. But could you go over that one more time quickly?
Yeah, so sure. So when we talk about the Midwest getting 10 to 15% wetter, it's not that every rain event is getting 10 or 15% more rain or snow. What it really is it's being driven by more of these heavy rain events. So if you look at 2 inches, or if you look at the other way, there's some analysis in the report on the top 1% storms. So those are kind of the extreme of the extremes. Those are all showing a big increase in the amounts that they're producing. So it's really these heavy rain events that are driving this overall wetter conditions. And, another thing we didn't talk about that is problematic, and I've seen this a couple of times already during the growing season. If you ask a farmer, which would you rather have, a 4-inch rain in one afternoon, or 4 1-inch rains spread out over a couple of weeks? And I'm sure they pretty much would all pick the 1-inch rain spread out over 4 weeks rather than 4 inches in one afternoon. So, the effectiveness of this precipitation is reduced as well. So if you get 4 inches in one afternoon, you get a lot of runoff, a lot of flooding. A lot of it doesn't get a chance to soak in and really do your crops any good. And then it's, struggling for a couple of weeks till the next big rain comes. So it does mask some other problems that we've been seeing in the Midwest too.
Very good. Okay. Any other questions anyone has, or comments? Going once, going twice. Thank you all very much. Thank you again, Jim, and the audience for. Jim, did you provide your email address in case there were questions? I don't remember if you did at the very beginning.
I don't think I did. It's just, I like to get away from it. So just email.
You can always email me, and I'll. Yeah, go ahead.
That's right. You can, or jimangel@illinois.edu. It's probably somewhere in the report too. Yeah, my full name is Jim Angel.
Jim Angel at Illinois.edu.
Yes.
That's for all the media folks on there that want to do stories with you.
Yeah.
So, or anyone else. Anyway,
That's right.
Thank you again, Jim. That was excellent. I appreciate your time.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Everyone else's. All right. Thank you, and have a great afternoon, everyone.